Before the KGB, there was the NKVD in the 30s that was responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of people.
Like the pogroms and stuff?
No. Pogroms were ethnic, anti-Jewish for the most part. Riots.
Right.
No, this was the Great Terror during the 1930s that Stalin launched against real and imagined opponents in order to bring the country completely to its knees.
Mr. David Satter, welcome back, sir.
Hi, Julian.
It has been a long 9+ months since you've been in here, but you were here right after the invasion happened, maybe a couple weeks. And I think it's fair to say there are a lot more people in America now who are aware of Ukraine and the importance it plays in basically like the middle of the map over there. And thanks to our episode, which did get a lot of clips to go viral, which was pretty cool, people are now somewhat aware of your story as well.
Well, I'm glad to hear that. And there's certainly a lot to talk about. And the crisis isn't over. In fact, in some ways, it may be just beginning.
Yeah, that's the scary thought for a lot of people. But for those who didn't have a chance to hear you in episode 92, can you just give a quick background on your career and your history working over in Russia and Ukraine?
Well, I was the Moscow correspondent of the London Financial Times, but I served in that capacity during the Soviet period, and I, in fact, reported from Russia at the height of the Soviet Union's power. The Soviet Union at that time was really probably the most powerful military force in the world. And they had thousands and thousands of tanks in the middle of Europe that were poised at any minute to overwhelm Western Europe. But after I left the Soviet Union, and that was a long time ago, that was 1982, I began to write a book about the Soviet Union, which turned into a book about the fall of the Soviet Union. And in one way or another, I've been writing about Russia ever since. I've written books about the fall of the Soviet Union, about the rise in Russia after the fall of the Soviet Union of the criminal state there. I've written about the apartment bombings that brought Putin to power, and I've written about the Russian people and the psychology of the place, and of course the events that led up to the present Ukraine war.
Very quickly, can you just give a little bit of context on the 1999 apartment bombings? Because, again, for the people who didn't hear last time, this was really the story that made you, because you were the only Western reporter to blow the whistle on what Putin did. So can you just explain that background a little bit?
Well, this is the point. This is the most important event in Russian post-Soviet history, because the country was totally corrupt. And Putin was appointed by Yeltsin, who was totally corrupt. And Yeltsin lived in fear that he and his family would be criminally prosecuted. And Putin was put in place in order, as prime minister, in order to guarantee that that didn't happen. And they blew up apartment buildings in the middle of the night and killed hundreds of people. In fact, they're lucky that a bomb placed in a building in Ryazan, a city southeast of Moscow, didn't go off, because it would have been not 300 people, but more like 1,100 who would have been killed.
And they did this as a false flag to start a war?
Absolutely. They blamed the bombings on the Chechens, who had a breakaway republic at the time and had defeated Russia in the first Chechen war. And they launched a new invasion of Chechnya that boosted Putin's popularity, and someone who was unknown, who had no political background, no charisma, who was identified with Yeltsin, who had a popularity rating of 2%, suddenly became a national hero because he managed to convince, with the help of control over the information media, convince the people that, in fact, he was the defender of innocent Russian people who had been murdered in their beds by Chechen terrorists. And so, in effect, the regime that has existed in Russia since 2000, when Putin was elected president, is an illegitimate regime. It's a regime that was put in power as a result of an act of terror against the Russian people. There was an interesting quote from a man named German Ugryumov. Ugryumov was a high-ranking official of the FSB. That's the successor organization to the KGB. And he was widely attributed with the role of organizer of those bombings. And he was quoted as saying, "We had to bomb those buildings in order to put Putin into power."
Who did he say that to?
This is something that was circulated in the leadership of the Russian government and was reported by people who had heard it. But let me tell you what the full quote is.
Please.
He said that we had to bomb those buildings in order to put Putin into power. How much blood are we going to is going to have to be shed to remove him? And within 2 months, Ugryumov was dead.
This is back in 2001 then?
No, this was 2000, under mysterious circumstances. Now, the bona fides of the quote are not something that we can absolutely confirm, but it is something that was circulating, and it's very, very plausible. But even without the quote, which in fact I believe to be genuine, what my experience as a writer is, making up quotes that are that good is not simple. By and large, something that's really resonant was probably said by the person to whom it's attributed, because most people don't have the imagination to just make something like that up. In fact, the exact quote was a little different. He said, we had to bomb the buildings in order to put Putin in the Kremlin. How much blood is going to have to be shed to remove him from there? That's the exact quote. And that's been repeated many times in the Russian internet. So it's not
even in their internet and everything.
Well, yeah, because they don't control everything that appears in the Russian language in the internet. Well, our
videos are banned in Russia.
Well,
Just
that's,
to let you know.
that's a tribute to you. That means that some people like you, like me, they make a special effort to ban. But a lot of stuff circulates. They don't try, and they're not able to control every single word. In any case, that appeared a fair amount of time ago, and in the context of articles about how many people have been killed who were in one way or another connected with Putin, connected with the FSB, connected with the apartment bombings. But the point is that even without that saying, even without that quote from Ugryumov, the evidence that they bombed those buildings themselves and used it to start a war that would put Putin into power is overwhelming and incontrovertible. And I've written about this.
Yeah, you wrote books on it. You wrote articles at the time when it was coming out, basically trying to red light everyone to see what was happening here, and nobody listened, which I don't know how you're like, I said this last time, but I don't know how you have such like a happy-go-lucky attitude
I'm not sure
about life.
I don't know how happy-go-lucky I am. Maybe when I'm with you, and your example kind of has an influence on me.
Well, that's good, because you seem to, you're very passionate about speaking on what is now a central topic in the world that took a long time to get there, but you also have a lot of skin in the game, because this man and his regime have killed friends of yours. They've affected some of your direct family. They've affected your ability to even live there as you did? Because
Absolutely.
For context, again, for people who didn't hear last time, you were officially banned from Russia in December 2013, right?
December 2013, yeah. This was actually December 24th. It was Christmas Eve. And since, Ukraine is an Orthodox country, the 25th is not celebrated as Christmas. The Orthodox Christmas is a little later, and as a result, the embassy was open on the 25th. But on the 24th, the diplomat in charge in the Russian consulate said that we just don't have an authorization here. And I said, but look, I've got the necessary documents on me. And he said, I can't explain it. I said, have you ever had a situation in which someone who had been given the necessary documents did not get an authorization from Moscow? He says, this is the first time it's ever happened. And then I called, he advised me to call the foreign ministry, and I did call the Russian foreign ministry, and they said that I should contact a diplomat by the name of Mr. Gruby. I remember his last name. Alex Gruby, yeah. And in any case, I called him the next day, and he says, I've got something to read to you. And that was a bad sign. And he said that the competent authorities, which is the term they use for the intelligence services.
Is that the FSB?
Yeah, the FSB, the Federal Security Agency, has decided that your presence on the territory of the Russian Federation is undesirable and you're banned from entering the country. I was the first American journalist to be expelled from Russia, to be banned from Russia since the Cold War. And I believe that, in fact, it was the Maidan revolt that was the reason for my expulsion, because they had tolerated me for a long time. And the reason they did so was because they didn't want to give the impression that they were concerned by me. They wanted to give the idea that, well, this is a conspiracy theory, and we're not going to dignify it with an answer. But after Maidan, they decided that was a luxury they couldn't afford anymore, and they wanted me out.
Because that was when... I'm going to forget the names, but that was when the Ukrainian people were trying to push out the president who was basically a Putin puppet, and then they did?
Yeah, I mean, up to a point. It's Viktor Yanukovych. He was the president. He was an elected president, but he was thoroughly corrupt, and there was no law in Ukraine, and he had used his position to amass an enormous private fortune, and the country was very poor. And he had promised, or he had indicated, that he was going to apply to the European Union for membership for Ukraine in the EU. I mean, he was going to seek an invitation. And at a conference in Vilnius where it was expected that would happen, it didn't happen, and there was no indication of when or even whether it would ever happen. And that was a huge disappointment to Ukrainians who looked to the West, looked to the European Union for the possibility of a better life, a life without corruption, without lawlessness.
Had there been some sort of agreement? I'm just curious about this. Had there been some sort of contingency agreement upon the dissolution of the Soviet Union that Ukraine? Like, we know it was like, okay, Ukraine's not going to join NATO, but was there any type of handshake agreement that they weren't going to look to join the EU or other organizations as well?
Well, there was nothing that said that they wouldn't join NATO either. And certainly nothing that no agreement to not to join the European Union. There was a lot of pressure from Russia on this score, but Ukraine never agreed to that.
Got it. So that whole thing is what initially launched Putin's taking of Crimea in 2014, which I think we talked about as well. So,
well, I think that Putin took Crimea for a very specific reason, in order to distract the attention of the Russian people from the Maidan revolt. The thing is that there were 200,000, 300,000 people on the street in Kyiv.
Yeah.
I saw it. I was there. And Putin had to be afraid, especially after the protests in 2011 in Moscow that took place after the falsification of parliamentary elections, that the example of what happened in Kyiv could be imitated in Moscow. And it was imperative from his point of view to change the conversation, to switch the attention of the Russian people from the example of a self-organizing democratic anti-corruption movement in Ukraine to the restoration of Russian greatness, so-called, which he best achieved by seizing Crimea. And it worked. And it worked. The Russian public as a whole stopped paying attention to what was happening on the street in Kyiv and gave itself over to mass euphoria over the annexation of Crimea and the idea that Russia's greatness is being restored.
So the majority of the people were very, very in favor of that?
Absolutely. And it pushed Putin's popularity to, if I'm not wrong, 82%.
Is that number real or is that inflated?
Unfortunately, it's probably real.
Wow. So but again, that's a while ago now. And so we can fast forward to get to the present day. And I love your context of history that you have, because you effectively were in that country from 1976 when it was still the USSR until 2013, 2014. You spent a lot of time to this day in Eastern Europe on the circuit, especially now. So there's a lot of context we can add. But you talk about having some sort of, not a stalemate, but Putin effectively takes this land, changes the narrative as you lay out, and then we have 7.5, 8 years where it's kind of status quo like that for the most part.
Well, not entirely, because they also invaded eastern Ukraine.
The Donbas region.
Yeah, in the Donbas region, there was a war going on, and that war never ceased.
And did that happen? I think you did say this last time. I just can't remember. Did that happen at around the same time where they did the bulletless takeover of Crimea?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, it came almost immediately afterward, and there was heavy fighting there, which eventually settled into trench warfare and a stalemate.
Right. So
up until, of course, the February 24th invasion.
But outside of that argued over region where they were fighting, the rest of the actual situation, including business of the land as far as natural gas flowing through Ukraine into Europe, stuff like that, that was all somewhat status quo. And then Putin decides to come into the country on, I guess, February 22nd. 24th of 2022.
Yeah.
So let's start here. Where today, as you understand it, where do things stand in Ukraine? How much, like, obviously the people of Ukraine have put up a very valiant fight. This has not been something where Putin was just able to come in and run train and take over, which I think it seems like he expected that, and that was not the case. But where, like, strategically on the ground, because, again, you were just over in Prague and meeting with different people who are aware of the situation, like, where are things right now, and how positive does it look for Ukraine to continue to hold their lines?
Well, the Russians have withdrawn from Kherson in the south, and that was the last major city that they had taken. So they're not in control of any major cities.
I'll put that map in the corner of the screen.
But there's a lot of territory that they still occupy, and of course they occupy Crimea. And they occupy large sections of the eastern Ukraine, which is what they annexed before. Annexed in the sense that they took over and created these little statelets, the Donetsk People's Republic, the Lugansk People's Republic, and so on. Right now, the Russians are not making any progress against the Ukrainian army, but they're trying to entrench themselves in the occupied territory and then rain destruction on the civilian economy of Ukraine, which means the population as well, bombing electrical stations, infrastructure, anything that heating plants, anything that can be done to inflict misery on the population and death, and in that way force Ukraine to submit, and submission would take the form of not contesting those areas that the Russians have seized and that they still occupy and where their troops are dug in.
Well, there's an incredible amount of, as I think with any war, but especially in a modern day war with the internet, there's an incredible amount of propaganda online. And it does come from different directions, and I understand why Ukraine would have to take part in some of that. If it's like fighting fire with fire, it's just a shitty part of war, I guess. But, you know, I find myself when I'm researching on the war and trying to figure out exactly what's going on, assuming that nothing I see is the full story right away. And that makes it difficult because there are a lot of narratives out there. But one of the things that is really a narrative that's starting to take over in the U.S. that I wonder how much of it is actually based on what the people here are thinking versus what they're being told to think, which I don't know the balance there. But the thing that's happening in the U.S. is we're starting to have a lot of people question the amount of money flowing to Ukraine. And for context, Ukraine has roughly, I think it's like a $225 billion annual GDP prior to the war. I'm sure it's lower given that the war is going on. But we have given, at this point, I believe 12 figures worth of money in less than a year to the country. And so when I look at this, and especially when I've had some of the CIA guys in here, like Bustamante, especially him with this, and Jim Lawler as well, in discussing it, it seems to me like Zelensky and the Ukrainian government are effectively in the midst of them getting invaded and needing help to fight against that invasion, which the rest of the world does care about. They're effectively becoming somewhat of a client state to the U.S. Do you think that's fair to say?
Well, I mean, they're totally dependent on the shipments of arms to defend themselves. If they didn't have that, they could not defend themselves because Russia started the war with a far greater arsenal than Ukraine. But that, to be a client state, that means that we determine everything that they do, or most of what they do, and that's not the case.
Hey guys, got an important announcement for you, and it's pretty exciting. We officially launched a Clips channel on YouTube. The page is called Julian Dorey Clips, and you can find it by going to the current show page, clicking the channels tab, and it's right below there. Please, please, please go over and subscribe. We're posting daily clips from the episodes of the show, and hopefully it's going to help this thing grow. Anyway, if you haven't already, please be sure to share this episode around on social media and with your friends. I say it all the time, and I will keep saying it because it is very, very true. Sharing the show is the best possible thing we can possibly get because it spreads the word, it helps the algorithm big time, and it gets us out there so that we can continue to get great guests like this and even level up and make this show as great as possible. So thank you to all of you who have been sharing the show around, and thank you to all of you who are going to do it now. If you haven't already subscribed and liked the video, please be sure to do that, and I would love to hear from you guys down in the comments below. Finally, if you haven't left a 5-star review on Spotify or Apple, please take a second and do that. It's a huge, huge help, and I appreciate everyone who has already done so. I almost forgot. We are, in fact, working on a Patreon. Finally, we should have something live within the next month or two, and I will let you know as soon as that is up and running. Can't wait.
I think that what's happening is that the United States, for its own reasons and in its own interest, is trying to help Ukraine defend itself because we defend the principle of non-aggression and respect for territorial boundaries, not just in this case, but all over the world. So, and the world has an interest in a rules-based international order in which people understand that aggression is unacceptable. And it's that understanding that preserved the peace as a rule in Europe since 1945.
Yeah.
So in effect, what we're doing is we're by giving arms to Ukraine, we're defending the world order on which we ourselves depend. We're not losing any lives. They're the ones losing the lives, and they're suffering terribly. But at the same time, we're providing what we can provide much more easily, which is equipment, military aid, ammunition, weapons, the things that make it possible for them to stand up to an aggressor and in the process reinforce stability for everyone.
So when I look at this from a high level and try to figure out potential outcomes here, because everyone would like to see world peace. We know that doesn't exist, but when situations like this break out, getting it to a point where things are put back into order and lives can be saved is always a priority of people. But to me, it does seem like there is an awful lot of pushing down on any suggestion that there is intelligence that suggests that there could be some peace on the table. And to expand upon what I mean by that, there was a letter that we've talked about on this show now in at least like 3 or 4 episodes, but there was a letter that the Progressive House Caucus wrote to Biden in a few months ago. And it was leaked, which means, they probably purposely leaked that thing out of some fear. But the implication of the letter was they wanted to reiterate they're huge supporters of Ukraine, and they do not want to see Ukraine take a loss, and they would like Russia to be put back in their place. That said, their understanding is that there was intelligence to suggest that Russia would be willing to come to the table where we could get some sort of solution where Ukraine does not get, the lines are redrawn back to pre-February 24th, and we get some peace because, again, in addition to Ukraine, the world is dealing with the fact that Russia is a major nuclear power who has a leader who's a sociopath and also doesn't look long for this world with his health. We can talk about that later. But, people get worried that some crazy shit could go down. So do you think that there has been a little bit too much call for just complete Russian blood as opposed to a little bit of, say, common sense to get Ukraine a W? Maybe not the W that like Russia still does exist afterwards. They're not like gone off the face of the earth, but at least now there's support and there's precedent such that there's an understanding that if Russia dares sends another missile into Ukraine, the world will act.
It's a complicated situation here because if we make peace with Russia on Russia's terms, in other words, if we pressure Ukraine, we could say, just a hypothetical situation, we're going to cut off the money, the weapons. You have to make peace. I mean, that's what happened with the South Vietnamese. We cut off the weapons to them, and they were in 1975, I think it was, and they were overwhelmed by the North Vietnamese. They couldn't continue. And in fact, we cut off the weapons in Afghanistan too because we removed the contractors who were critical to servicing them. But let's say we made that threat to Ukraine. We're going to pull out. You have to accept Russian terms. Then that doesn't serve our goal of reinforcing the principle that you cannot seize territory by force. Turns out you can. And not only that, but we're endorsing it. It doesn't matter in this case that maybe Russia will, pull back from a couple of critical places. The idea that they've taken this territory in an unprovoked attack and that they're able to keep it after committing war crimes, massacring civilians, raining down destruction on civilian infrastructure. I mean, that's not a precedent that we want to that's not something that we want to encourage. The other thing is, and this goes back to the question of a warning. If you send one missile, then all hell's going to break loose. Well, I'm not sure that Russians believe that. I'm not sure that, but the one way to make those threats credible is to defeat them and create a situation in which they understand that peace is better because you have nothing to gain from war.
So, but if we were able to draw the lines to pre-February 24th and basically force them to retreat and also add into any deal that there is a renewed reinforced protection of Ukraine against any future funny business, wouldn't that be some sort of a win, considering that as things stand right today, though Ukraine has fought valiantly and not lost the war at all, and they're doing a good job, they have lost some land. They've lost 10, 20% of land, and they would be able to get that back and get the Russians the hell out of their country. Wouldn't that be pretty solid?
I think that means that they're basically Russian aggression is not punished. That they've started a war, they've killed tens of thousands of people, and they haven't paid any price for it. They've merely evacuated territory. If indeed they would evacuate territory, that they seized illegally anyway. I mean, if we go back to the February 24th lines, in other words, it's just as if the war had never taken place. That means there's no punishment for the war.
Well, what about just two devil's advocates there? What about the fact that A, there are continuing financial implications and world trade implications that we correctly put on them, and B, they also, Putin has sent a lot of Russian, let's call it what it is, borderline kids, 18, 19-year-olds, untrained, into this war who have died, who don't even know why they're there. That is a price too. It's not just like...
It's a price in human terms, but in terms of the Russian leadership, it's not important. They literally don't care.
Well, that's sick.
They are, and this is what's so frightening about them. They will sacrifice those young men without limit. And in fact, Putin himself recently made a statement in which he said that Russians are willing to sacrifice everything for their motherland. This is something the West doesn't understand. Well, the real meaning of that statement is that I'm ready to sacrifice all Russians for my welfare. But it's, of course, not phrased that way. So that price doesn't worry them. As for the sanctions could be significant over a long period of time. But they, in and of themselves, will not force Russia to give up the remaining territory, and they will not prevent Russia from starting a new war at the earliest opportunity.
I think the big thing that comes across to me in the fear there is not necessarily, like if you looked at Russia with their GDP, for example, that which we know of.
Yeah.
It's the size of Italy. It's big, but it's not anything like China or something like that. The fear is that you have a dictator who has been president forever, right? Changed the Constitution. And that dictator, one thing they do have is they got a hell of an arsenal of nuclear weapons. And that just makes people, for all the right reasons, I might add, very fearful of like poking the bear and everything. So maybe a better question that the way I could have asked it is do you have to take into account the safety of the rest of the world over, say, a couple of the immediate issues in Ukraine just to make sure that we avoid D-Day, like a bad kind of D-Day, like a nuclear kind of D-Day?
Well, I think, of course, we have to take into account the interests of the whole world, but the interest of the world is best served, I think, and I think many would agree, by not rewarding aggression and making sure that the conditions no longer exist for a renewal of the conflict. Russia fought the first Chechen war. And they pulled out. They even pulled out in the end ahead of time. But
when was that?
This was in 1996 with a pullout. The war began on New Year's Eve, 1994. And even though they signed a peace treaty with Chechnya, 3 years later they bombed the buildings and launched a new attack, claiming, of course, they were defending themselves against attack.
Yes.
So, it's possible that we could buy a couple of years of peace, but the basic problem would not have been settled, which is the right of Russia to dominate its neighbors and seize their territory.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where it feels like you're looking at losses all around, like you're kind of stuck, like you're a gambler at a table a little bit. And that's not the fault of, in this case, the world. I mean, Russia's the one who did the invasion. But I get worried that, I mentioned it a few minutes ago, so maybe we can even talk about this now. But
yeah,
according to intelligence reports, and also if you use your eyes a little bit, you can kind of see it. Not that is all the answers, but Putin doesn't look like he's in good health. He did confirm that he had cancer in 2015 or 2016 or 2017, somewhere in there. At least he had told Oliver Stone that, and Oliver Stone also quickly confirmed that it had returned about 6 months ago. We see the videos of Putin holding the table. I'll put that in the corner where he's like holding on for dear life and shaking. It appears there's some elements of like a Parkinson's like disease there. Mm-hmm. And it lines up with the fact that he did a crazy, clearly not well planned invasion when all this is going on. And it makes you think like, okay, narcissistic, sociopathic dictator type wants to leave his legacy. You mentioned it earlier, talking about like a renewed, restored Russia. Does that mean that someone like that could also say fuck it and try to take everyone with him when things aren't going his way because he's not going to be here long anyway?
Well, that's a worry, that he could behave recklessly. As for his health, we don't have any confirmation of that. And I personally don't consider Oliver Stone a very good source. But I think that there are more actors here than Putin himself. I mean, to launch a nuclear attack definitely requires the cooperation of other people, not all of whom would be enchanted by the idea of starting a nuclear war over the annexation of a strip of Ukraine. So, of course, they will do everything they can to scare us with that, and we're right to be scared because there's aspects of the situation we don't control. But we also have nuclear weapons. We have it's if he's going to go down and take the whole world with him, that means there's even more reason to somehow try to get him out of there and bring about a change in Russia. And the most important agent for doing that is military defeat.
Yeah,
because that would break the chain, the connection between lying propaganda, horrendous military losses, foreign aggression, and the sense on the part of ordinary Russians that their country, by brutalizing others, is returning to former greatness.
Right. Well, how realistic do you think it is? Let's assume Putin's healthy and great. How realistic do you think it is to remove him from power at any time soon?
We don't know. We don't know what's going on. We don't know who in the leadership. I mean, that's the best chance that people in the leadership would insist on his leaving power and or conspire against him. But they're all, they're informers everywhere, and people are spying on each other. No one can be sure that if he begins to organize a conspiracy that it will stay secret for long. So, oftentimes dictators in this type of situation hold on for decades.
Is there any type of real picture or better picture now as opposed to the last time we talked as to, let's say, candidates of individuals who might replace him in that event? Or do we really have still no idea?
We can speculate. I don't think we really have a clear idea. I think it could be someone in the end who is very unknown to us.
And it's scary because, I mean, you assume it gets better with whoever replaces him, at least a little bit.
That's not necessarily true.
Yeah.
But I don't think it would get a great deal worse. I think we're touching the bottom.
Well, that's the campaign for the war. It can't get worse than this.
No, if they use nuclear weapons, which they could do, to stave off defeat, it will get worse. But what's the alternative? The alternative is, for us basically to allow them to win and then create the conditions for a new war.
I think, and that's where that catch-22 comes in. You and I may have touched on this, but it comes up in some podcasts where no one wants to be Neville Chamberlain.
No, of course.
But also then you get in this situation where it's like, well, what is a real Hitler situation versus what is one where it's like, okay, there's...
I mean, can Putin be negotiated with?
Yes.
Is he reasonable? Will he accept a fair solution? Well, all indications are he's not and he won't.
But if that did change, it should be looked at as a possibility to keep those lines of communication open to try to get a peaceful solution.
They are adept at suggesting things they know are non-starters. For example, they say, well, let's negotiate. We're ready to negotiate an end to the war. What they don't say is that this negotiation is intended to allow them to keep the occupied territories.
Yeah, and one of the things that does bother me at this point, because it's difficult to defend, as someone who has for a long time been fascinated with the rise of Vladimir Putin and was at least somewhat aware of the downsides of him, that wasn't widely talked about by a lot of people before this war. It kind of was less of an issue, which was part of the problem you had. But, it's getting harder for me to defend some of the theatrics that you see coming out of the Ukraine side. And I have no doubt that there is propaganda arms who want to make sure everyone like me sees that coming out of Russia so that we can turn the tide and suddenly not be rooting for Ukraine. But what I'm wondering is why are they parading Zelensky to do things like a Vogue cover shoot or to have Sean Penn come in there and give him a fucking Oscar trophy? Like, these types of things make people think at home, like, what is this? I thought this is a war. We're doing cover shoots? Like, why is the Western media so obsessed with almost pushing this reality TV narrative on top of what is a very, very real war and kind of taking away from what's actually happening?
I think the Ukrainians are very concerned to maintain popular support in the West. And anything that they think will make them more popular, they will definitely be in favor of. Whether they do it in a very intelligent and effective way or not is another question.
Yeah.
Maybe they don't.
I think that's the issue.
It's very tough. I mean, they don't know, they're dependent on a country that they don't really understand and don't know very well. Hang on, I think that this...
Oh, did that go out?
Came out. Let's just put it back in.
Yep, and then twist it. Can you hear it now? Now I hear you great. There we go. I just usually tuck it in the side of my chair right there, so it doesn't go anywhere.
Okay, no, that's fine. That makes a big difference. You were just getting a little faded on me.
Oh, all right. Well, I'm glad we got you right back there in the earphones. But on staying on this topic, do you think as the calendar moves into 2023, we're recording this a few days ahead of time, and this is going to be the first episode that we put out of the year, where we're coming up on, in a month and a half, we're coming up on the 1 year mark. And you had mentioned very early on when we were talking that this is the kind of thing that has the makings of something that could go on for years. Do you think that we are going to see any talks that are in the realm of trying to remove that Russian aggression, punish them for it, and actually get a solution here where there's not civilians dying on the ground every day? Or do you think that's very unrealistic to see this year?
Oh, I don't know. A lot's going to depend on there's so many imponderables here. We don't know the effect of Western sanctions on the Russian economy. We don't know how much ammunition the Russians have left. They've been expanding it at a fantastic rate. We don't know how the Russian people will react to these horrendous casualties. I heard a story that gives you an idea of just how bad it is. In Belgorod, which is a town in Russia but on the border with Ukraine, there's a big railroad yard and a lot of freight cars. And people in the area are complaining that the smell from those railroad cars is becoming unbearable. And these are the bodies of Russian soldiers that have just been dumped. They aren't even. The Russians aren't even collecting they're dead and wounded.
Yeah.
So how long will the Russian population, agree to this? How long will the U.S. continue to embargo or weapons that could hit Russian territory that would have the capacity to take out those points that are bombarding Ukraine right now?
Yeah.
How long will it be before the West begins to really answer Russian propaganda seriously by, for example, telling the truth about the apartment bombings and demonstrating to the Russian people that the Putin regime is their enemy as well as the enemy of the Ukrainians? These are all questions we don't have answers for right now.
Do you have any source? I'm curious. Do you have any sources who are telling you what if there is some serious dissenting sentiment on the ground in Russia right now that's growing, or is that also just totally unknown?
Well, we know that the population is becoming more skeptical. We know that. Polls showed that Putin still has about 74% support. Now, that's with the benefit of state television, which is the chief source of information, which knows how to act on the emotions and prejudices of the Russian people. But still, that's a very high level.
That is a high level.
And especially after all these casualties, after all the obvious lying, after the mobilization announcement. But still, I think that, Russia is organized like a movement. It's much more than like a normal country. And a country organized like a movement is always ready to go and attack somebody. And that's one of the things we have to deal with. That's one of the things Ukraine has to deal with for its long-range security. I'm hoping that the factors will begin to create pressure on the Russian leadership to stop what they're doing. It's going to take resolution, both in terms of supplying arms, which NATO is willing to do, and
wait, what was that? It's going to take a resolution supplying arms?
Resolution in terms of supplying arms to Ukraine.
Oh, right. I misheard you.
So that so we will not lose heart, will not lose determination, but it's going to take really the effort of an entire society, and by this I mean Western society, to bring this to an end. Just as a simple example, a lot of the green activists, a lot of the climate change activists are very much against any expansion of the production of fossil fuels. But this is how we need to wean countries off of Russian oil and gas. We can't do that if we don't expand our production. No, the political pressure not to do that is paid for with the lives of Ukrainian soldiers.
Yeah, it's kind of like you're in a position where you got to make some sacrifices of your beliefs, even in the short term. You're saying, I understand that.
and of course we have to be ready to accept economic hardship, which is the hardest thing of all, especially for comfortable Americans and Western Europeans, and that's what.
Yeah, good luck selling that.
Yeah, no, it's not easy. It's not easy, and it's certainly not easy if people don't see the underlying point.
I think it's way different when you have something that you talk about like economic hardships, and you see, let's even say from a rationing perspective, for example, the sacrifices that Americans made in World War II, say. That's one where A, the whole world is actually involved on the battlefield, and B, so are we. Our own people are there too. It's very hard when you don't have, and by the way, I give Biden a ton of credit for not putting boots on the ground there, because I think that would turn into a world war, and I think that's disastrous. But we don't have that, and so there is this "it's over there" sentiment that is going to be a part of that conversation, regardless of how much a guy like you knows, or other people who really know the implications here try to pound the table and say, no, but you don't understand. People are going to vote with their wallets. They're going to be concerned about their way of life. And it's not just in America, it's in other places too. So when we're talking about making sacrifices around the world, I don't think politicians are going to be able to sell that, because their people are going to vote them out of office if they do that.
Well, this is the problem. And so the next best thing is to ship weapons. Yeah. which do make a difference and allow the Ukrainians to do the fighting, and they do the dying, which is one of the reasons why Zelensky is so insistent. Yeah. And it maybe even shows what Americans see as a lack of gratitude, because the way he sees it, the way we see it, we're giving him weapons. The way he sees it, they're sacrificing lives.
And that's a very fair way of putting it, in my opinion, because his every day that this war is going on, as the leader of his country, he is losing his citizens.
Of course.
That's just the nature of it. And I think people have to understand that.
And people are being bombed and are experiencing terrible hardship, being subjected to war crimes. So, of course, he doesn't think that just the supplying of weapons is such an extraordinary thing.
Sure. Particularly
insofar as the Ukrainians are fighting for our principles, not just theirs.
Yeah, and I think it's, it feels oddly reminiscent. Like, obviously the Russian government is, in an order of doing business, a different side of the coin, and in a negative way also as well, though, than it was with the USSR. It was a different type of politics back then. However, it feels similar in a parallel way to that Iron Curtain that descended, where you kind of have two, not even political, but like way of life ideologies at battle here, and the proxy war in the middle of it is the fact that it's the Ukrainians who are on the battlefield being victimized by it, and the Russian citizens who are losing their lives, who are conscripted to go fight in this war.
Yeah, I mean, what you have is you've got a small criminal group in Russia that is killing both sides.
Yeah.
And is indifferent to their lives and their loss and the losses. I mean, even that statement that Putin made, that Russians are willing to sacrifice everything for their motherland, well, that gives you an idea of the extent to which he feels he has an inexhaustible supply of cannon fodder in the population.
Yeah, I think that's fair. I mean, but on the other half of it, like, because this has been a situation that you've been on top of for 50 years, as we've laid out, almost 50 years, it's like, how much were you following Zelensky's shift to politics like right when he initially started looking at it? Like, how much are you a historian of him as well, and like what he's about and why he got into this and moved away from what was a great life? I mean, he was like a very successful actor and everything, and got into politics. Like, what is it about him that made the people of Ukraine say, "Oh, this is our guy. This is who we want to lead us," before the war and everything?
Well, there was so much corruption under Poroshenko. I mean, Poroshenko replaced Yanukovych. And then the same corrupt system exerted itself, and so the result was a rebellion against Poroshenko, and Zelensky took 70% of the vote in the election. But conditions didn't improve all that much under Zelensky, and people said that, in fact, now before the invasion, he only had about 30% support.
Why was that?
Well, I think it was partially the fact that, Ukrainians are impatient. They want to see improvements, and he wasn't delivering them, and many of the same corrupt structures continued to hold sway. But, it's another question of what he could have done, and did he do his best? But the fact that now he's in power, under conditions in which he's fighting, an invasion, and in which he's the country's only hope. I mean, that changes all that calculation. Instead of, when it was Poroshenko who was president and who was not solving the problems, it was kind of logical that an outsider like Zelensky would be elected. And when he didn't solve the problems, it made sense that there was discontent with him. But when Russia attacked Ukraine, and people are losing their lives, and the country is being menaced, and Zelensky took over and directed the effort, it's also logical that those pretensions, that discontent that existed in the past, is now forgotten, at least for the time being, until such time as the war is won.
Well, he's a wartime leader. I understand that.
And so that's both outcomes are logical. I mean, in the sense that it was logical that when the country was not at war, and one problem after another manifested itself, that the person in charge would be blamed. It's also logical that now that the country's at war, all that's forgotten, because he did behave very bravely.
Yeah, he stayed back. There was the talk right away when it was going out, like, oh, they're going to get him out of there.
Yeah,
whatever,
no, of course.
Stayed.
Well, that kept the country from collapsing. I mean, there would have been guerrilla war, of course, but if the president and the government had evacuated, the organized resistance would not have been what it was.
In addition to him staying on the ground, though, with his people as like the leader of the country, I think another thing that sometimes gets lost in translation of like how things are working, just because we hear the top line news, is what it means for his role as the head of the military every day. So, you had mentioned before, and I know Bustamante had talked about this on here, and Jim DiOrio as well, that there's a lot of elements of on-the-ground civilian trench warfare going on in city streets and things like that. But what about the military organization of Ukraine? Like, does Zelensky have a set of generals where it's kind of like there's a top-down mandate, but then they're all making their own military decisions, or are all major decisions coming directly through Zelensky? Like, what do we even know about how that's working?
He has to approve. He has to approve the decisions of the Ukrainian general staff. But I've talked to Ukrainian politicians who are much more familiar with this than I am, and including members of the Verkhovna Rada, the parliament. And they say that Zelensky basically, his role is to kind of, approve the plans of the top generals, and he's not a great strategist, but he puts a face on it. And of course, I guess when there are conflicts, he has to decide. But he doesn't have a military background.
No, he was an actor.
Yeah, he was an actor. So really, his role in this whole situation is to, on behalf of the country, to approve the plans that have been presented to him by the military leadership, which is what he's doing. And that military leadership has undergone quite a lot of modernization.
How so?
Well, partially they've been trained by NATO. The Russian military is very top-heavy. And the units on the ground have much less freedom of action than would be the case for a NATO country or a NATO army. The Ukrainians have been trained by NATO on the NATO model, and they're much more flexible. And that's one of the reasons that they're fighting in much smaller units. There's much more initiative at lower levels of command. And it's made a difference. It's made a difference. But the overall strategy, after all, that's something that has to be put together by the general staff and approved by Zelensky.
Well, how effective is the other thing you hear about in the background on various stories is some of the work of the Ukrainian intelligence as well, who's in the middle of a war zone on their home base here.
Course,
but like how that wasn't before this war. I'm not going to sit here and lie to you and pretend to have known a damn thing about Ukraine's intelligence apparatus. But like, how good are they versus how much is it they're getting a lot of resources and help from other intelligence organizations in Western powers,
including the U.S.
Yes.
Yeah, but it isn't only that. I mean, remember that this is all being fought on Ukrainian territory, and it's being fought in areas where people support Ukraine. Now, we could say, if we looked at the Donbas, that some of those areas that were occupied were areas that were Russian-speaking, ethnically Russian, and pro-Russian. But the war now is being fought in many areas where where the patriotic sentiment is Ukrainian. And so they get intelligence from the population. It's not it's not a mystery.
It's a true militia type organization in that way. They're fighting for their land, and they're basically
of course,
and
that's understood.
Sure, that makes me think of a parallel issue, though, that maybe has something to do with this as far as like how to read the situation, or maybe doesn't, and you can fill me in. But,
sure.
You've mentioned in our last episode and a little bit today about these Chechen wars. You had the first Chechen war, the second Chechen war, and Chechnya is a region, as you've explained, to the south of Russia that has their own sect of people who have had in the past serious disagreements with Russia and have wanted independence. But today, now call it 20 years after, say, the Second Chechen War, maintain, as I understand it, actually a relationship with Vladimir Putin and have even fought on his behalf in
some Chechens.
So I guess the question there is, is there the fear that because obviously that involves leadership of Chechnya coming over to the side of Vladimir Putin. It involves perhaps some propaganda going into their people to agree that this isn't the worst thing ever. Is there fear that there could be a similar sentiment shift over a 5-10 year period in Ukraine as well?
That's what Putin and his associates are hoping for and counting on. There would be enough of a fifth column in Ukraine to make it possible for them to rule. I mean, that has not materialized so far. Outside of the Donbas and outside of Crimea,
which was already kind of the case as you laid out.
Yeah, I mean
right.
we kind of knew that in those places.
Yes.
But the other areas that have been invaded and annexed or taken over since February 24th, we don't have evidence of a lot of collaboration.
That's good.
At least not. I mean, there were some collaborators. Some of them were actually killed. Some of them fled. But widespread collaboration sufficient to govern those territories, even if the war stopped, so far is not in evidence.
Well, what do you think? You and I have talked at length today already about the issue of the precedent this would set if you didn't do something to combat what Russia's done. And I think for pretty much anyone listening, that's completely understandable and a pretty easy concept. But from a hypothetical situation, minus the precedent it would set if they did pull this off and say annex Ukraine, worst case scenario, something like that, what would be, if you're talking about Russia as a threat and that happened, strategically speaking, other than the obvious of they get a big chunk of land that was on mainland Europe of a nation that was supposed to be sovereign but now isn't, like, what are the major implications of that? Do you think it becomes now Putin wants to start grabbing land across Europe and starting to invade EU nations? Or do you think it's more there's the unknown and we don't want to deal with the unknown?
Well, under the existing circumstances, bearing in mind the degree of Ukrainian resistance, bearing in mind the resilience of the Ukrainian nation, the chief consequence of a peace settlement on Russian terms now would be simply to reinforce the hold on power of Vladimir Putin, because he would depict it as a victory. The Russian with the help of the propaganda on state television, the Russian people would accept this explanation, and he would be in a position to launch. First of all, he would have undermined world stability with a successful invasion and land grab, but he would be in a position also to terrorize his own people and to launch further adventures in the future. And there are other candidates.
And we do see that there's been an inability, as you mentioned, to turn off a lot of the dependence on Russian oil and natural gas that's still been in line since the war started. I mean, what's crazy to me is you have Ukrainian companies who are pumping natural gas from Gazprom through their country, which, they got to make their money and try to keep the lights on. I totally get it. But that's wild to me. Literally the nation who is invading them, one of the oligarchs there, one of the people, I forget the name of the guy who runs Gazprom, but like a government-related rich guy individual who runs this company, his nation is invading you, and he's still business as usual.
I mean, the problem is that this complex energy infrastructure was built up around Russian supplies.
Yes.
And it's not a simple matter to disconnect it overnight.
No.
Even for the Ukrainians.
And exactly. It's such a weird. That one was such a weird conflict of interest to me, but I don't have an answer for him. Turn it off. That's going to crush them if they do that, and then it crushes the countries that they rely on giving it to.
They also need the gas.
Yes.
They also need the gas. I mean, it's people were betting. Ronald Reagan, when he was president, warned against a gas pipeline because gas can only move over pipelines unless it's liquefied natural gas, and once those pipelines are in place, you're attached to Russia, attached like an umbilical cord.
And when you stop. By the way, from a political perspective, you've seen the emphasis the EU has put on anti-fossil fuels and things like that, which some of that is certainly understandable. You then, when shit hits the fan, here you go. Now they don't have it. They don't have the capabilities.
Yeah, we need if we could expand our use of fossil fuels, we can make up for some of those Russian supplies.
Yeah.
And thereby, make it harder for Russia to wage this war. There's a lot of how to describe it. There's a lot of infantile thinking in the West, and including in the U.S. I mean, the fact is, I want what I want, and I don't care about the consequences. But the consequences can be very serious for other people.
Well, it's because you're fighting for your next election, and you don't want to cost your people money now.
Well,
so
of course.
You kick the can down the road.
Well, we've seen it.
Yeah. And we had one of the things that happened since the last time we talked, one of the many things was you saw the Nord Stream 2 pipeline blown up. And, I think I was telling you, I talked to you shortly after I recorded a solo podcast on that. I recorded that podcast, I put it out, and I immediately thought, like, even the possibilities I put out there were wrong. Because I'm like, well, I see it could be one of 4 places. It could be Russia, it could be the U.S., it could be Ukraine, or maybe it could be China. And, we were really zoned in on Russia and the U.S., and now the news is starting to trickle out that, like they even said, like, that's not the case. Like, it appears Russia didn't do this, which I thought it might make sense for them to do it, but they didn't. And it doesn't appear like the U.S. did it, which means, there's some, it could be like Ukraine trying to keep the West on board. But at the same time, what's confusing to me is that there wasn't really much running through it at the time. It was basically like turned off. And at least for this winter, based on the information I was able to review and other people can find online, it appeared that the Western Europe was going to be okay with what they had, meaning this wasn't going to affect things right away. So, I guess the question is, like, why do we have other forces at play here, like other nations who are just enjoying the chaos of what's going on and trying to ensue some sort of distrust among the people on both sides of this issue, be it Russia, be it the United States and the West?
Hard to imagine. I think that it probably was Russia who blew up their own pipeline, but they did it in a way that would they hoped would affect the market, but would not, permanently. They didn't want to take a step that would be irreversible.
What's the upside to them? That's what I couldn't figure out.
Warning the West of their vulnerability.
Because I couldn't think of a ton of upsides.
There aren't a lot of upsides, but we have to begin to think the way they think.
And what's that?
We're thinking, this is the problem when Westerners try to think rationally, and they operate always from their perspective. But Russians oftentimes are very keen. Remember, Russia is the country of the psychological novel. It's a country in which, with the national game is chess. Russians think ahead, and they think in terms of psychology in a way that we don't.
Can you explain that?
Well, for example, I mean, they will act not to achieve a specific concrete effect, but to have a psychological impact.
Like a mind games type thing, you're saying?
Yeah.
Huh. That makes a ton of sense. Because that would make sense with, some of the things they do to sow dissent.
Even if we go back to the apartment bombings, does it make sense to bomb your own people? No, unless you're trying to change the psychology of the country.
Right.
And create a completely different atmosphere. I mean, an American wouldn't think of doing something like that.
Cue the conspiracy theorists in the comments on that one.
Yeah, well, all right. Well, maybe people will call in and say that Trump or Hillary Clinton would do it. Maybe they, I don't know, but even I think those two wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're prone to having bad people do bad things too. I would like to think, and I do think overall.
But our
better
bad people are less imaginative than their imaginations. They are more restricted.
I think you might be right about that. I think there's degrees to this stuff, and I can point out evil things that we've done, of course, around the world, and I can point out evil things other places have done. And I think overall, I see more. I'm not just talking about Russia. I'm talking about places of totalitarianism and some of the things they do to their own people, that I think are worse.
There's a saying in Russia, terrorize your own people so that others will be afraid.
That's real? Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty on brand right there.
Yeah.
And what is, during the whole war, though, like, as a lot of people know, that when the Soviet Union flipped over, it changed to basically being called the FSB, but it wasn't that much different.
The KGB became the FSB.
Right.
Yeah, the KGB was, under the Soviet Union, the secret police were the KGB. And then after the Soviet Union fell, there were some various permutations and changes, and the organization which emerged was the FSB, which is in Russian Federalная служба безопасности, means the Federal Security Agency.
So they effectively were the byproduct, the afterproduct of the KGB, kind of like name change and name only type deal, doing a lot of the same things.
Now, a lot of the same things, but they were different too, because the KGB was an ideological organization that believed it was spreading socialism, and they were actually very clever. The FSB is very corrupt, and they're much more murderous. The KGB tried to achieve its objectives with psychological manipulation, and at least in the later years, did not rely on brute force as much. Although although they could.
That's not the narrative you're used to hearing,
Well, we're talking, listen. Before the KGB, there was the NKVD in the 30s that was responsible for murdering hundreds of thousands of people.
Like the pogroms and stuff?
No. Pogroms were ethnic, anti-Jewish for the most part.
Right.
Riots.
Right.
No, this was the Great Terror during the 1930s that Stalin launched against real and imagined opponents in order to bring the country completely to its knees.
What did that consist of? I don't know a hell of a lot about that.
Oh, well, all right. Maybe let's take it a step at a time, because we're the Soviet Union, after it was created, declared that it was going to have a final reckoning with the counter-revolution, and they created the first, the secret police, who were called the Cheka. And the Cheka was responsible for the Red Terror, which took place in the 1920s. The Red Terror cost maybe 400,000 lives.
And what was that?
That was taking hostages, that was fighting against anybody who was opposed to the Bolshevik regime, with mass killings. In Sevastopol in Crimea, 50,000 people were hanged, and that earned Sevastopol the nickname "the City of the Hanged."
Wow.
But then there was the Great Terror, which took place in the 1930s, 1937-38, and Stalin basically launched a drive against anyone who could conceivably be his opponent to create a perfect totalitarian system. And 150,000 people in that period were arrested. No, not 100. Excuse me. 1,500,000 people were arrested during that period. 700,000 were shot right away. Of those who were sent to the camps, many never returned.
Oh my God.
And then.
And what types of these were anyone who just opposed the Soviet communist principles?
Anyone they suspected of opposition, but also went beyond that. The purpose was to completely terrorize the country. So, let's say that you had studied in Poland as a graduate student, okay? You were automatically a Polish spy, and anyone who was in your notebook or in your address book was your co-conspirator. And that created, the fear that engendered, and the purpose was to engender fear. And it was I knew a woman who was the wife of an ambassador in Moscow at that time. And she said, the terror was so great that if a foreigner approached Russians on the street, they scattered like mice. And people who were literally afraid to say anything to each other. There was one story of a a conversation on a train in which one person said, yes, Fyodor Mikhailovich, yes, Vitaly Ivanovich, but beyond that, they were paralyzed with fear and couldn't say anything else.
Who were those people?
Just people on a train. Someone recalling in a memoir, what conversations were like during the period of the Great Terror. Mm. And that continued in a less extreme form because the war broke out and until Stalin's death in 1953, and then in 1956, Khrushchev made a speech, which was known as the secret speech, in which he revealed the crimes of Stalin and began freeing people from the labor camps. So the level of terror diminished. But the KGB still used repression to control the population, and they could kill people. But it was not mass killing anymore. But there was selective terror.
When did they change their name from the other one it was to KGB?
From the NKVD to the KGB, yeah. I think that was in the 50s. It became first the MGB, which was the Ministry of Security, of State Security, and then it became they decided not to call it a ministry anymore, and it became the Committee on State Security, the KGB. And then after the Soviet Union, and in the last days of the Soviet Union, after Gorbachev basically initiated this huge period of liberalization, the KGB did not, carry out terror attacks on the citizens, and they, in fact, were much more concerned with grabbing property for themselves, and they began, seriously to degrade and become corrupted. And when killings took place, they were fights over property, not political struggles. And then after the fall of the Soviet Union, what had been the KGB became, after certain changes and name changes, the FSB, which is what we have now.
And did some of it, I want to come back.
And that FSB, just to finish what we were saying,
please.
Was different from the KGB in that it was much less. The KGB in the latter period, for example, when I was in Moscow, was much more concerned to use psychological, control over people. But the FSB inherited that, but they, even though they became rather murderous because they were also fighting for money and property, but they never lost the concentration that had become traditional on psychological manipulation. So, in the case of the apartment bombings, they combined, a horrific crime,
yes,
with a psychological objective. The idea to terrorize the population and create the conditions for Putin to come to power. That's the most important thing to remember about the Putin regime, that it's an illegitimate regime, and it came to power as the result of an act of terror against its own people.
Was there aspects, though, and I want to come back to Stalin in a second, but just real quick while you're on this, where the intelligence transformed to getting to the FSB, were there also aspects of the KGB, because that's the only intelligence organization we hear about from the USSR years, I guess the second half of it, but were there elements of the KGB that got split off into the GRU as well, so they kind of like made an extra area of intelligence?
GRU is separate. GRU is defense intelligence. Those are rival intelligence agencies. The KGB the KGB is state security. The GRU is military security. Of course, they overlap to some extent.
I was going to say, because the GRU, for example, is who's responsible for like hacking in our country into discourse and things like that.
Oh, they still exist. I think, I'm not sure if they still use the name GRU. I think they do.
They do.
Yeah,
at least that's how
they do. It. Yeah, and there's the SVR, which is foreign intelligence that works with them. These there's a process of organizational reform and reorganization that takes place.
Yeah, it's interesting though to hear about Stalin though, because as we've mentioned earlier on, you are a true historian of the entirety of the Soviet Union and how it got to where it did, and then how when it was supposed to change over it did, but it didn't. They kept a lot of elements, which we'll talk about. But it's such a hard moral thing for me to think about in hindsight, in that we already used the example in something else today about like Neville Chamberlain bowing to Hitler and what that did to the world. But when we went to beat Hitler, who we can all agree was a horrible dude and did these awful things to human beings, we also partnered with a guy who did a lot of these things too.
Oh, absolutely.
Absolutely. Stalin, the more I hear about him, I mean, this was a murderous, awful guy. And so I kind of struggle with that in hindsight, in the sense that it's almost like we batted 1 for 2 when we did that war. And it's not to take away from the importance of what we did, and not just us, but all the Allied powers in preserving a free world to exist within parts of the planet after that, obviously. But that set off a Cold War because the person in this case in particular who's in charge there was the same.
Well, yeah, I mean, these were two totalitarian regimes, and people, particularly in Eastern Europe, point out that communism claimed more victims than Nazism, partially because they had more time.
Yeah.
But the special horror that is reserved for Nazism is that Nazism was murder as an end in itself.
Yeah.
The communists killed, but they killed in order to create what they said was a workers' paradise, or a just society. The numbers were astronomical in both cases, but the idea of simply murder, the Nazis elevated murder to the highest principle and the highest goal of politics, whereas once the Soviet regime was established, and once it no longer was fighting against various enemies, the mass killing stopped.
Mm.
The goal was not to kill, but rather to create a certain type of society. In the case of the Nazis, the killing would have never stopped.
But
because once they had finished with the Jews, the next target was the Poles. And then even those people even Germans who were mentally handicapped so it was an extermination machine set in motion by one basically gifted psychopath.
It doesn't. My only issue with that is I agree with you on Nazi Germany and what that was. I think that it's been well documented pretty easily. And there is the element that, yes, Stalin did kill Jews, for example, people on the basis of their background, their ethnic background. But it seems to me like Nazism was more to preserve ethnic and racial insanity tied to their identity as a party of their country, whereas it was the same thing in Russia, except it was more to preserve political identity. So how would they, I don't know, Stalin died, I guess, in 1953 or something, but let's say he had lived another 20 years, and I'm not sure this is what you're saying, but correct me if I'm wrong here, it's like, you think the killing would have stopped at some point where he said, okay, we're good? It doesn't seem to me like that was on the table.
Stalin was constantly looking for new. In fact, he was on the verge of deporting and exiling the Jewish population of Moscow when he died, and those plans were dismantled. And but the murder on the level of the Great Terror, there were periodic purges to kind of reinforce his hold on power, rather than because he needed to carry out these purges.
Well, what about at the very beginning, too? Like, he became this guy. He became the longtime leader of the USSR.
Yeah.
But, I think sometimes we forget, at least in America, we forget about that part of history of, like, how it began. I mean, this thing was, you had Tsar Nicholas and his family essentially as royalty in charge of the country up to 1917, and then they were rounded up and executed by communist rebels who formed the USSR. But, was there... You're talking about filling us in on the history of the 20s and 30s in particular, and these various mass killing machines that went on.
Yeah.
Obviously, the government had control of the media. They could suppress the spread of news, but they're still taking, as you said, 1.5 million people just for that one program. Those people have family, people talk and stuff. Like, based on when the USSR formed or started to take over in 1917 with communism, like, how long was it before there was a serious societal-wide backlash against it versus a lot of people were just like, no, this is kind of cool.
There was never a backlash against it until a significant backlash until Perestroika and Gorbachev began to provide truthful information, because the combination of propaganda and fear was enough to and also Stalin purged people in leadership positions. Ordinary people, by and large, were not touched as much. And it's unfortunate characteristic of Russian people that they have a vision of government as a force that terrorizes, and a strong government is a government that terrorizes a lot. This was the case in their attitude toward Ivan the Terrible, who was very popular among Russians.
When was he?
Well, that was
19th century?
16th century.
Way
long
back.
Time. Yeah,
way back.
But Stalin remained popular, and remains popular today.
Really?
Yeah, in Russia, but despite his methods, because it was seen as in the interest of the state. And we have an echo of this in the recent statement of Putin that I mentioned earlier, that Russians are ready to give everything, to sacrifice everything for the motherland. In other words, it's a very warped situation in which they so identify with the state and so little with their own individual dignity that they consider it normal for people to be killed in the interest of the state. And that's part of the reason why they're able so easily to invade a country like Ukraine, because there's no check, there's nothing, no limit of conscience, no limit of social institutions that keeps Russia from engaging in barbarous behavior. And it's one of the reasons why they commit atrocities, as they did at Bucha in Ukraine and in other places, Mariupol, when they invade foreign countries, because they consider that this is their right. There was a young Russian officer expressed the point of view when he was, when he talked about, his role in the war in Chechnya. He said that I answer for my men, my platoon. I don't answer for anyone else. If there's a sniper on top of a building, I call in artillery strikes on the building in order to destroy the sniper, even though I know there are civilians living in the building. If people are unhappy about that, they should, take their complaints to the people who cooked this kasha. In other words, the people who created this situation. My job is to destroy the sniper. The fact that, there's civilians, including old people, women, children, and so on, in the building that I'm going to blow up just so that the building collapses and the sniper is killed, that's their problem.
Just a different...
very much so.
Trained mentality. But I mean, how did... You have a regime that's built on reinforcing that mentality. And I'm talking about the USSR now, and of course also today. But there was a point there when, as we've laid out, when the USSR fell, that it was like, oh my God, Russia might become a democratic stronghold or whatever, where there's free elections and fair elections and stuff like that. Yeah. And that's not how it turned out. But what led up to that was you had a guy get into power, I guess, in like the late 70s or early 80s with Gorbachev, who, as you said, decided to, it was Perestroika, right? Was that what it was?
Well, the reforms, and they were called Perestroika, yeah.
Right. So how did there finally, like, what led to him getting power? And like, did he have a change of heart as he climbed the chain of command and then realized like, oh, I'd rather us be more democratic? Or was he always that way and wanted to reform the system that they had put into place?
I doubt he was always that way. He was somebody who moved up step by step in the Communist Party hierarchy. And he saw, however, that the Soviet Union faced problems that only, as he understood it, liberal reform could solve. And one of those problems was it was falling behind the West technologically and economically. So that was the inspiration for it. But also because many of the younger Communist Party officials were mesmerized by the material wealth of the West, and they wanted personally to share in it. Those were all factors that led Gorbachev to take the risk of reform.
And he also, he left power after the USSR fell and everything, but he lived up until August of this year. So I've seen some stuff online, but first of all, how much did he even have an ability to speak his mind without the threat of his life and his later life? And secondly, like what were was he very supportive of Vladimir Putin? Or
no, and I mean, and I think but he was silent. He was silenced, and I think living in Russia, he almost had to be. What he said was carefully controlled, and what he could say.
It must be wild for him because he's supposed to be the guy who got them to a place where it wasn't like that and people could do what they wanted, but it didn't. You replaced psycho left wing with psycho right wing, which is kind of the same thing, where the political circles meet each other.
Yeah.
And you get what you get. But, something you and I had talked about towards the end last time, just a little bit, but I wanted to get in more, is actually one thing that I feel like is kind of now not talked about at all. So maybe you can shed some light, but that is the whole oligarch system. And what you had a chance to lay out last time was how in the 90s there was a giant power vacuum that happened, and in the democratization, what was supposed to be the democratization of the USSR, you had limited individuals basically get control of all key industry. As we know, the oligarchs, a lot of them were backed by crime or were criminals themselves, and then basically formed this group who controlled all the GDP of the country, and therefore
not all of it, but a very, very significant part.
A lot of it.
Yeah.
So the reason I bring it up is because one of the main stories at the very beginning of the war was these sanctions we were putting on Russia, and a big part of that was the sanctions we were putting on the oligarchs, most of whom have interests abroad, outside of pretty much all of whom have some sort of interests or residencies abroad in other countries. And I haven't heard a ton about that since. And what I was wondering is, behind the scenes, was there any real threat of like waning support or having some of these robber barons, so to speak, switch sides because Putin was costing them their ability to have influence and be themselves on foreign lands? Or have they all basically said through either threat or just political agreement that, hey, this is the right thing and we're getting behind this guy and we'll deal with the fallout?
Well, their opinion doesn't matter. I think they were all unhappy about what happened because it threatened their economic interests for sure. But Putin had basically reduced the power of the oligarchs to the point that they were dependent on the political authorities and not the other way around, which was the way it was under Yeltsin. And so therefore, and he had much more over them than they had over him. So we haven't heard much from them.
What do you mean he had much? Because that seems an obvious statement to me. But how so? Like, why does he
you can arrest them. They can be. He controls the justice system. He can seize their property. He can control their movements, take away their passports, ground their airplanes. A lot of things he can do.
But do they hold also any sway behind the scenes quietly that the public doesn't know about in still some of these Western nations where they've had a foothold for a long time?
Oh, in the Western nations, probably, because they have extensive business interests.
So like in the UK, where there's a significant presence of Russian oligarchs, I haven't heard much about, we heard the sanctions at the beginning, but it seems like these guys are alive and well and doing their thing. Or are they're
very
favor?
rich, and they have money stashed away. And some of it they've lost, and some of it they're just spending. But obviously their position is not what it was.
Mm. But also on the other side of it, is there a similar setup? Like I have a guy pulled up behind you right here. If you look at the screen right behind you, this dude, Ihor Kolomoisky, is that how you say it?
Ihor Kolomoisky, yeah.
So he's curious to me. I don't know much about him, but he's reported as like a Ukrainian oligarch. So he's on the other side of the issue. Is there a similar cohort of people who effectively curry the same level of power and favor like that in Ukraine?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There are, but they have, they were. I mean, the situation in Ukraine was more pluralistic, whereas the oligarchs were all beholden to Putin. And whereas the oligarchs in Ukraine, they backed very different political. I mean, Kolomoisky backed Zelensky. Other oligarchs backed Poroshenko. And it was a more pluralistic situation. But in the post-communist countries, particularly Russia and Ukraine, certain well-placed people were able to gain access to state assets and create empires, basically on the basis of theft.
Yes.
In cooperation with organized crime. And then they tried, or they hoped, to dictate conditions to government. In Russia, that lasted only as long as Yeltsin was alive. When Putin came into power, he threatened them with criminal prosecution and created his own oligarchs, mainly made up of his cronies, who became rich on state business and state assets.
Yeah, I think he threw. Who's the one guy he threw in prison?
Khodorkovsky.
Yes, that's it. So that was one of the guys.
Well, and also, Berezovsky was forced to flee, and Berezovsky was, I believe, murdered, although the oligarchs are not the key to the situation now.
Who is? Minus Putin.
I think the Russian military and the intelligence services. And I think that there have got to be people in those organizations who understand that this war has to stop and that the country is being destroyed by the war.
Haven't some of those people been disappearing though too?
No, that the people who've been disappearing are those who have, some type of economic interests that have come into conflict with those, in the regime, and with persons in the regime. Plus the fact that under conditions of sanctions, there's a fight over diminishing resources.
Wait, what?
I mean, but the U.S. and the West have imposed sanctions, and that's disrupted the economy.
Right.
A lot of people have had assets seized. A lot of
Yes.
people don't have money that they thought they had. A lot of people have debts they can't repay. A lot of people are sitting on money they don't want to return. And so a whole new set of quarrels has broken out as a result of an unexpected and quite different situation.
I just, I talked to a guy like you, and I was joking with you earlier. I don't know if joking's the word, but, when I went to pick you up from the station in March when you came here, it's like a week after the war broke out, and I'm the farthest thing from a spy, but I find myself sitting in the car looking 300 yards in every direction to see if someone's following you. And I didn't see anyone, but I might have missed someone. I don't know.
We don't know. We never know.
You walk around with such a on the outside relaxed demeanor with your own background and the threat that your brave reporting has posed on your life and everything. But it may be a bit of a personal question, but I am very curious, and I know a lot of people out there listening are. Do you worry about things getting threats on your life as a result of the current situation and the fact that you continue to be a guy who will go on anything, on every mainstream platform, non-mainstream platform, and spread the word of the things that you know to be true about Vladimir Putin?
Well, you cannot be sanguine about the Russians and about the FSB and about their reach. You have to be aware that they are capable of committing crimes, and they're capable of victimizing even Americans, even though that's generally something they avoid. I think in the present situation, they have a lot on their plate. The danger was greater earlier when I was saying things that no one believed. But now that Putin has demonstrated that, to any unbiased observer, that what I was saying is true, taking action against me will not solve their problem, because now the view that they're capable of doing what I've accused them of doing, i.e. committing acts of terror against their own population, is so plausible that there aren't a whole lot of objections. I mean, just for example, I have a piece coming out in 3 days, in the Wall Street Journal, in which I discuss the apartment bombings. But I don't think that there's a danger at the present time. But that's just based on my instinct after many, many years of dealing with them. I think they don't want to do it. I think they don't want to cause anything to draw attention to my accusations.
And I don't think they, sit from my seat, the international incident that would be harming a Western American journalist, I think would make the Jamal Khashoggi implications we saw in a separate situation look tame. I mean,
this is the point, and it's also an attack on, I'm well known in this field. And it would be an attack on the ability of America to understand what's going on. I mean, it would really be something that would strike at the American political and intellectual process itself. I don't think, what would they gain from it, really? It would only publicize everything I'm saying.
And I agree with that.
Now that said, it pays to be careful.
Yes.
And I am, and even though I may seem casual, I'm more careful than you realize.
Well, that's good, because you're hiding it well. But, I mean, I do wonder sometimes, and I had mentioned this to you in the car on the way over here today, the colleague in arms on the Russian apartment bombing situation from Russia's side of the media was Alexander Litvinenko.
And he was a former FSB agent as well. So that they also have a particular animosity toward people they regard as traitors.
Yes.
Because I never worked for them. I mean, as one person explained it to me once, he said, we understand an enemy. An enemy is an enemy. What you can't change him. There's nothing you can do with him. And after all, we're enemies too of some people. And particularly an honorable enemy. But a traitor, this is someone who has eaten our food, as they the Russians say, or who belonged to us and then turned against us. That's a different consideration, and particularly, and it's also if they see a Russian as a traitor, they feel that they have carte blanche with Russians. They don't feel they have carte blanche with Americans. It doesn't mean that they can't kill Americans. In fact, they have killed. I mean, Paul Klebnikov, an American journalist, was killed in 2004.
2004. So
it was a long time ago.
That was pre-Litvinenko. What happened to Paul?
Paul was a very fine writer. He worked for for Forbes magazine. I didn't know him personally, but I was familiar with his work, and I later, after his death, met his widow. He wrote a lot about the corruption of the oligarchs. He wrote a biography of Boris Berezovsky, who was maybe the most famous of the oligarchs. And but he had a tendency to idealize, and this was, I believe, his big mistake, to idealize Putin, idealize the FSB. Even though for all his talent, and he had a lot,
Wait, am I understanding that correctly? Idealize, like make them seem good?
I think he saw them as a progressive force, potentially, a force that could bring good things to Russia in the future. I don't want to characterize it too much for him because he's not alive, he's not in a position to say what he thought. But in any case, he did collaborate with them to some degree. In fact, as sources of information. And that's a very dangerous relationship to be in with them.
So why'd they kill him?
Well,
and how
we
did
we have to ask that. But he may have, in their view, overstepped the line of what's acceptable for a foreigner by giving. He may have gotten corruption about the FSB. He might have tried to do something to alert them to the fact that they were on the wrong path or something. I mean, we don't know, but all the evidence is that they organized his killing.
Was he killed on U.S. soil?
No, in Moscow.
And how did they shoot him or what?
Shoot him, and then when they brought him to the hospital, they jammed the elevator so that to make sure that he died.
Oh, Jesus. Wow. Again, that is back in 2004.
Back in 2004, there was another American who was killed in a business dispute, Paul Tatum, who got into a business dispute with the mayor of Moscow and his various representatives. He was shot on the street. If you get involved, I mean, the full details of Paul's fate are not clear to me, but he got a lot of cooperation from Alexander Korshakov, who was the chief guard for Yeltsin and a KGB veteran, an FSB veteran, for his book exposing the corruption of Berezovsky. Of course, but Korshakov was just as murderous as Berezovsky, and he fell into a kind of dependent, apparently, and here, I don't want to say anything that isn't true, but he seems to have, in his writing and in his statements, had a unrealistic view of the KGB. There's a
the FSB?
story. I'm sorry, the FSB. There's a story in the novel The Godfather. Do you remember how it begins?
Mario Puzo's
Mario
Godfather?
Puzo's. A man whose daughter's been raped goes to
Yes.
goes to the mob and asks them to take care of the person who has. And then they say, but from that point, he belongs to them.
Yes.
Well, Paul may not have understood that in their understanding. They don't just help.
So the minute he does something they don't like, that's essentially a fate sealer, is the implication. Huh.
Now, I want to stress that that's how it seems to me. That's what I believe. But and I do believe that he was killed at the behest of the FSB.
But also, like you mentioned, Paul as well as Tatum, the businessman, both killed on Russian soil.
Russian soil, and both of them had, to a certain extent, become involved in the Russian world in a way that I did not. I mean, I was, as an investigative journalist or as a writer and historian, I was carrying out a function that was, recognized as part of my work. I didn't become part of what was happening there, except insofar as my writing and my speeches and so on. But I didn't have kind of relationships that would entangle me with either money or operations of some sort.
I see what you're saying, but you're still reporting massive truths that are highly against.
Absolutely, and there's and this is the thing. This is the thing about the KGB or about the FSB. I mean, we're getting our letters all mixed up because, it was the organization had one name under one regime and a different name under a different regime. But what I'm saying is that you can kind of guess what the borderlines are, but you can always be wrong.
What do you mean?
You can sort of guess what it's safe to do and where you're treading on very dangerous ground. But there are no guarantees here. There are no guarantees. In fact, I must give them credit. I think the fact that I was expelled from Russia, I'm the only American who was ever expelled from post-Soviet Russia.
Has that remained true to this day, through the war?
Yeah,
they haven't.
Well,
expelled?
others have left voluntarily, but is a tribute to the fact that they didn't want to do anything worse, and they could have. I mean, people mentioned to me afterward, he said that you can consider yourself lucky to have been expelled. Maybe that may well have been the case.
See, I would have said. The reason I was bringing in Litvinenko is because while you did make the distinction, he was an actual Russian who was
he was former FSB,
right? So in their mind, a traitor. But they did in 2006. They did kill him on British soil.
Absolutely,
right?
and they are capable of carrying out those. And he's not the only person who's been murdered in the UK.
No, who was the guy who they failed to murder?
Skripal.
Yeah.
And his daughter, Sergei Skripal. But we don't know what condition he's in, by the way.
Skripal?
Yeah.
That was a while ago, right?
Yeah, but he's alive. But was he permanently injured or disabled by the attack? We don't know. It was an attempt to kill.
Yeah, it was some sort of It was the chemical agent
No,
as well.
but bear in mind that Skripal was also a former. I think he was former GRU.
He was former. Yeah, I don't know if it was GRU, whatever
or
it was.
SVR. I'm not sure.
He was former Russian government.
Yeah,
Yes.
well, he was intelligence as well. I mean,
Yes.
he was, and he was exchanged. So, I mean, the long answer or the short answer to your question is that it pays to be careful, and I try to be careful to the extent that I can. But I do want to continue to lead a normal life, which is essential if I'm going to keep writing. So,
you seem to be doing a pretty good job with it. You seem to be all over the place doing your thing. So I hope that continues. I just
that's also a form of protection, by the way.
Going everywhere.
Oh yeah,
get in your face. Yeah.
Well, yeah,
absolutely. I know. I
going
understand.
on a podcast that's going to be seen by a lot of young people, and not only young people but old people.
That's right, and that's why I love being able to use the platform we're building to get stories like this out there, because it's on there for the record. Can't take it off. That's right. What it is.
That's right. And a lot of people see it and think about it.
Right. So, I would have said, because the heat they got for the Litvinenko thing, and righteously so, was nuts, because they did it on foreign soil. It was figured out that they did it, and they had sanctions, and the world flipped out.
Well, don't overestimate it. 2006, Litvinenko was killed. Theresa May, who was the Interior Secretary, squashed a full-scale investigation for fear of alienating Russia. And 2 years later, President Obama inaugurated the actually, it wasn't 2 years later. It was, I'll tell you when it was. He was 2006. And,
well, he got in 2008.
And
Litvinenko was 06.
So about a year and a half later, Obama and Hillary, who was then the Secretary of State, announced the reset policy. So as if nothing had happened.
Right.
So that's not really much of a deterrent.
Yes.
I mean, the Litvinenko murder was one of many, many, many missed opportunities to limit Putin and prevent what's going on now.
And you discussed having meetings with, I think it was you and Nemtsov were meeting with dignitaries of the United States trying to warn them on all this.
Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered in 2015, and we spoke to a leading official who was one of the architects of the reset policy, and explained to him how misguided it was. But it was, it was on deaf. It went to deaf ears because he had his career to think about. He knew what Obama expected for him to say, and he wasn't going to jeopardize that.
But I would have thought, because again, 06 is right before social media started to become a really big thing, and Web 2.0 was coming in, where there's real mass communication on everything at all times. It's like, I would have thought that that's not something, as in murdering someone else that you don't like on foreign soil, was something that Putin would use so brazenly. But then you mentioned it's a news report that people have probably seen. There was a guy a few months ago, Rapoport. What was his first name?
Dan Rapoport.
Dan Rapoport.
No, Rapoport. He was a friend of mine. He was and we don't know what the story is there. I mean, I found his death very suspicious. He fell from a roof of a building in Washington. Was killed.
And that's what I'm saying. In the United States, and it certainly looks sketchy. So what was his? He was someone. What was his full background? He was someone who spoke out against Putin and the regime. But what?
Yeah, and
what
he
were some of the things
worked
he did?
against it, and he worked against it. But he was a bit at the time. Until very recently, living in Ukraine and working on various business deals. And he moved back to the States after the war broke out. And then I learned that he had committed suicide. He was a good guy, and it's all unexplained. It could have been a business rivals. It could have been people who were angry about his work in trying to get companies to disinvest in the from Russia. But anyway, we're trying to find out what really happened with him. I mean, there are many puzzling details.
And you're meeting with his wife.
Oh, a little bit later, yeah.
Right, I mean, today.
But I know her, and I knew him, and we want to find out what we can.
What does she think?
Well, I'm going to find out. I mean, so far we don't. There are mixed signals. I would say many things don't make sense, but on the other hand, I think that there's still some possibility of discussing it further with the FBI, the Washington, D.C. police, and I don't place a lot of confidence in them. But still, they said that the cause of death was, of course, a fall, and but the manner of death is undetermined.
That's so scary.
Yeah.
Because you would think, I mean, especially now, there's literally a war going on. Everyone's paying attention to Putin and what he's doing, and
well, there have been a lot of mysterious deaths of Russians all over the world. People who holders of money in one way or another.
Who are some prominent ones that we should know about?
Well, they're just recently in India, a man fell out of a window who was the head of a local politician and the head of a big meat company in Russia. When I say meat company, I mean a really very major enterprise. One of the leaders of Lukoil, I don't know if he fell from a window or he fell down steps. Just crazy stuff. I mean, the death toll is somewhere like 13, 14 right now.
Absolutely, just. I mean, it's chilling to think about.
Yeah, I mean, these are gangsters, and they get and they hate each other and they kill, and they don't have any particular moral limits. But
why?
This is one of the reasons why we don't want them organizing a massive army with nuclear weapons to attack a neighboring country, because it's that kind of people are involved.
Why don't we hear as much about these brazen ones? I mean, even the Rapoport thing.
Well, there was coverage.
There was some coverage of that one, but like some of these other ones you were telling me about in the car, the one you just laid out there, very, very limited. I mean,
It depends where you're looking, of course. I mean, the thing is, the internet has become vast.
Yes.
The coverage, with so many. First of all, we once had just the newspapers. Newspapers, radio, etc. Now we have internet. Now we have blogs. So now we have Twitter. We have Facebook. I mean, there are lots of places to look, and we have YouTube and Instagram. So the people's attention is fragmented. But those, there are reports. There have been reports.
Well, I mean, that's good to hear, I guess, because maybe that means some of it I haven't seen. I mean, my perspective comes from avidly seeing what's trending on Twitter as it pertains to specific topics like this. And I think that, we touched on this a bit earlier, but didn't go all the way there. It's like, you do see these two teams form, and it's only divided as the war went on, where it's not in style to be someone who kind of sees the nuance of the situation as I've tried to lay out today. It's either you are Ukraine flags in your bio or you're reposting Tucker Carlson clips and stuff. And so when you're someone who's knowledgeable in all this, like you, who understands what's going on, also, and I mean this fairly, is going to have some bias because this guy's ruined your life and killed your friends, and you've been there for 45 years, or you were there for 40 years and then got kicked out. Like, how do you, when you see people who maybe are really pissed off, like we talked about it, at the money that's all flowing over there, and the fact that some of the people who are just screaming Ukraine are some of the same people that scream some of the woke stuff that the other side may not like, do you find yourself having trouble trying to convince people to look at the bigger picture here?
Well, we always have that problem. The Americans, unfortunately, are pretty pretty provincial in a lot of ways. I mean, they it's very hard, especially since we don't have the Cold War anymore. And the result is that America turned inward and began to focus on internal conflicts. We didn't have an external enemy, so we made enemies of our own people. And some of this competition is backed up by careerism, because careers are sometimes, especially in government, doled out on the basis of ideological preferences. Same in the media. It is indeed difficult to impress on people the importance of having a broader historical understanding, and the importance of viewing the events not superficially. I was watching a video somewhere on the internet of a woman, made by a woman who had whose Christmas was ruined because of a fight she had with her mother over politics, her mother and her stepfather, and she was crying, and she described how she said to her mother that I've come to realize that my parents are bad people.
Over the politics.
Yeah, and of course her mother probably reacted in a similarly extreme manner. But this is all possible. See, we don't want to resemble spiders in a jar, fighting each other over things that don't matter. But that's what it's become more and more in the U.S. And the reason for that is, for one thing, a tendency just to look no further than our own selves, our own identity, our own interests, and at the same time a lack of any kind of interest in history, a failure to be intellectually serious, and a refusal to recognize how much there is that we don't know. I mean, we've got a battle now in this country, and this is, and I say this in all sincerity, between the uneducated, who nonetheless rely on common sense, and the half-educated, who think that they're too smart to be guided by common sense, but who, of course, don't understand the half that they need to know but don't.
Well,
don't have.
I think it's because they hold what happens. It's basic human psychology, even with this, and maybe I'm oversimplifying it a little bit, but they find one thing that pisses them off where they have some great evidence to be like, yeah, there's a good reason this is pissing me off, and then they therefore decide that anything else to come out of that purview therefore must be tainted and not something I can pay attention. So as an example, you see people maybe get upset, like I was alluding to earlier, that Zelensky's this media darling or whatever, and I hear this comparison all the time. People will be like, oh, he's their new Fauci or something, which I do think is totally unfair. I think the guy's the president of a country that's under attack right now, and he's doing what he's got to do. There's some things I've laid out I disagree with, but the people who feel incentivized to go after him can't recognize anything that might be like
and they're
the reality
lazy,
of
and
it.
they're lazy as well. I mean, they're lazy and they're superficial, and they don't want to make the effort that's required. And a lot of I can tell you a story that might help illustrate this. When I was growing up, I grew up in Chicago, and every Sunday morning there were religious programs, usually evangelical Christians, and oftentimes they had rural, I would say, to be kind, accents, and they spoke at length about the evils of dialectical materialism, which is an aspect of Marxism that I'll get back to in a minute.
Okay.
I was a little kid, and I absolutely hated these religious broadcasts, largely because they interfered with programming that I wanted to see, like the cartoons. But And these preachers, these evangelicals, for me, were just the epitome of ignorance, with their nattering on about dialectical materialism. But even from that early age, I remember the phrase. Well, the years go by. I go to Moscow. First, I go to Oxford and I study political philosophy. Then I go to Moscow. And I studied the Russian ideology, and I finally came to the conclusion that everything that happened in the Soviet Union was based on the Soviet ideology. And then I came to the further conclusion that the essence of the Soviet ideology is dialectical materialism. So all these people whose ignorance I had taken for granted were actually right.
Wow.
And they understood something that it took me a good 30 years to figure out. Now, of course, this is a lesson for all of us.
Yes.
A lot of those people who we consider so ignorant and so unworthy of attention, and who are, in truth, oftentimes not terribly well educated, often understand things that the half-educated don't understand. And the half-educated would be well advised to moderate their contempt for those people.
Yes.
And try to first of all become fully educated, which of course it's only going to be very few people, but also try to engage with those who have a different point of view and to try to understand. Now, the half-educated also have their certain insights as well. So it should be a mutual process.
Yes. Well, and that's a great way to bring it full circle, because even from a political standpoint there, it has to be a two-way street. The example you lay out is apolitical in the sense that it applies to all angles. And I think you're spot on when you say that we have a serious problem in this country of recognizing those other points of views. I've mentioned this on some other podcasts, but I had heard Dr. Phil talking, I think it was a Joe Rogan podcast somewhat recently. He was on as a guest, and I can't remember. I got to go back and check this. I can never remember this. If he was saying he was a part of this study, like he was running it, or it was his friend who was running it. But either way, he mentioned a study at a college in California where they brought in like the Young Democrats Club and the Young Republican Club. And they put them all in a room and had them, they sat on separate sides of the room, had them argue about issues, and they were just going at each other like crazy. And so after a couple hours of that, where they were treating each other like animals, the study runners made each person from each side find a counterpart on the other side and had them stand directly across from each other, like all separately. And they just started with things as simple as stare each other in the eyes for 2 minutes and basic human connection. And then they worked their way towards tell each other where you're from, or about your family, or your full background, things like that. And they did this for a few hours to the point that people were emotional about it. And to a man and woman, every single person in the study, in their individual breakout session afterwards to discuss the results, mentioned how until they did that exercise, they never viewed the other person as human. And so I think
and that's how extreme things have gotten, and that's based on lack of education, unfortunately. We were talking about the Great Terror. The regime in the United States, or the system in the United States, prevents a Great Terror. There's so much that Americans take for granted because they don't have historical knowledge. And as a result, we weaken each other. We weaken our society, and we weaken our country. And this excessive aggressivity, which is confined to a set of cliched issues that actually don't matter, is only possible because people cannot see the broad picture.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not, people have their lives. The normal Americans, like any other country, they have their life to go about and priorities and paying the bills and taking care of their kids and stuff like that. And I don't expect people to all be like educated on every issue. I just take issue with the factioning of teams in 280 character tweets.
No, not only that, Julian, but the fact is that on issues they care about, issues that they're aggressive about, issues that they're willing to break relationships over, those are the issues where they're obliged to learn a little bit. And it's not, and to say that I don't have time, I'm too busy tweeting, it's not a good explanation.
I don't disagree that if you're gonna fight about the stuff or fight for your stance, you should have knowledge. I agree. I agree with that.
Otherwise, remain open and listen.
Right. I'm saying that the rest of the population who maybe aren't the ones sending those tweets, they get pulled into having to just get annoyed at this constant bitching and moaning, going back and forth, and
there are
out.
There are a lot of people who would prefer a more harmonious and a more open and reasonable atmosphere, and we have to work for that. And knowledge is a great source.
Yeah. Now, what on another note, what did you make of the Viktor Bout for Brittney Griner trade that went on? And before you answer that question, I do want to say I think the backlash against Brittney that certain factions have had is totally unfair, but I understand that on paper, if you're looking at like the value of a trade, we did trade away a very dangerous guy, and it's not like we got someone that's a danger to them, so to speak, back in the trade.
Yeah. I'm very sorry that Bout was freed. I'm glad to see that Brittney was freed, but I would have preferred it not to be for him.
Yeah.
Because he's a very dangerous. And he's dangerous in this situation. She's not a dangerous person. She made a mistake. She did not use good judgment. Okay, but that can happen to a lot of people.
Yes. Can you pull the mic in just a little bit? Sorry. And who was he?
He was, the person who supplied arms to practically every civil war and every conflict around the world, Soviet arms. After the fall of the Soviet Union, he was, culpable in hundreds of thousands of people being killed. He found the way. He often armed both sides. He was totally cynical, and those networks still exist and can be useful to Russia in the war with Ukraine. That's one of the reasons why he had to stay in prison. So I'm not, should we have? I mean, I'm sure politics played a role.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. And was the price too high to get her freedom? Well, what can you say? I mean, surely, we want to get any American out when they're unjustly locked up or given a sentence that's way out of proportion to anything that they've actually done.
Yes. At what cost is always the question. Fairly.
Yeah, I mean, at what cost? I mean, I'm thinking of the young man who was murdered by the North Koreans.
Oscar?
Ohio student. I mean, Brittney would not have been murdered, presumably, but it's better that she's out. I think had I been in Joe Biden's place or in the place of the administration, I would have tried to exchange her for someone other than Bout.
And it sounds like in their defense a little bit, it sounds like they took that off the table. It feels like Russia perhaps correctly so, realized they had a lot of leverage in this situation.
I think they did, and they realized that there would be this was a case that they could use.
Yeah.
Given the politics involved.
Did Bout have? I mean, you said he would supply both sides at different civil wars.
Well, or one side or another. He was.
How much of it was? It feels like in Russia, whenever there's powerful people doing things out in the world, they're tied to the Russian government. But how much of it was like completely on behalf of the Russian government versus?
I think it was because he was selling off Russian arms, Soviet arms, surplus arms, and says putting them exactly where they shouldn't be, in civil conflicts where they could be used to just and he was organizing all of that. So he was organizing wars, in effect.
But there's also it would be fair to say,
and they were all over the world.
It'd be fair to say though today, fast forward, there are other people like Viktor Bout operating in a very evil way.
Oh, sure.
Right now. Yeah. Okay. Because that's kind of what, like it or not, essentially what it amounts to is we let him out 7 years early. He was going to be deported back in 7 years. And we let him out while this war is going on. That's where it really ties in.
Listen, what's done is done. I mean, at least an American citizen has gotten her freedom, and that's good. And now, and he's out. He's somebody who should have stayed in prison, but okay. I mean, what's done is done, and I'm not outraged about it. I just think that it's a shame that we couldn't exchange her for someone else. Whether that, maybe if we'd been a little bit more patient, but then that meant her staying, in custody longer.
Shitty situation. No.
Yeah, it was not a good. We were not in a good place with that, and it's a warning to Americans generally to be careful when traveling to these countries.
Yeah, and I mean, I think now it's like, why would you even, if you're an American, why would you even go? Not
at this point.
Yeah, she was already there when this all broke out.
Of course,
but at this point, it's just.
Well, all right. I mean, we should learn from what happened to her.
Yeah, and it's not. There was another guy. What was his name? Paul Whelan.
Oh yeah, he's still in. And in his case, I think the charges are just invented.
Yeah, they tried to say it's espionage, which is probably bullshit.
Well, they want to get someone else out for him too, I'm sure.
Who else is on the list of like dangerous people? Like who would be next towards the top?
I don't know who they have in mind, but clearly they're resisting. In his case, they think that they can maybe get even more for him. I don't know, or maybe they don't.
Do you think there's any world in which Putin is not removed from power for someone who's Western friendly, say, so to speak? Do you think there's any world in which we'll ever see, if Vladimir Putin remains healthy and in power and the situation is resolved, we'll ever see, Putin at a G7 summit or any normalization?
No, Putin and never again. I mean, he's responsible for too many murders. I mean, all these people who have died in this conflict can be understood as having been murdered.
Yeah.
And no, I think that, and Russia itself will take generations to recover from this in terms of economic integration, if ever.
Yeah, it's amazing how far it fell. 30 years after the fall of the Soviet Union.
Absolutely.
Feels like they're back at square zero. But you and I had been talking about another book that had come out recently called Putin's People. We were talking about this in the car, and it was written by Belton, I think Catherine Belton. Mm-hmm. There was a guy in there who I hadn't asked you about because I was unaware of him, who served as like her main source.
Sergei Pugachev, yeah.
Right. Now, who was this guy? Because you were saying he supported Putin.
He was very much part of the ruling group, and he was a banker and very wealthy man. He fell out with them, or they, basically they double-crossed him.
When?
And this was some years back, and he ended up in Britain and is... carefully trying to expose them. He exposed, what it was in his interest to expose, and left out what could actually get him killed. And
Do you know him?
a little bit, yeah. I've seen him over the years. I would not fully rely on him.
You think he's just scorned because he got...
That, I mean, that, and I don't think, just my knowledge of his life and career suggests to me that he will not share that he will be very selective in what he probably has a lot of good information, but not everything.
I mean, that's a guy being interviewed in the media, which is one thing. He's a public source in that way.
Yeah.
But what about like behind the scenes? Obviously, it's not like we're going to sit here, including you, and necessarily know names or anything. That's kind of the whole point of it. But from a covert perspective, how much do you think that there's a lot of inroads happening right now with various agencies and governments having a significant growing number of intelligence sources on the ground in Russia, perhaps even in powerful places? Or do you think it's been a pretty tight ship where Putin has maintained authority and through threats stopped a lot of people from being any help, even if they're motivated to?
Well, the thing is, there's a lot of reason to share information, but there's a lot of repression. So I think that people who are outside the country and don't intend to go back are a good source. I'm not sure how much information you can get in from inside the country right now, not given the fact that the laws have become much more draconian, and we don't know where it's going to go. I mean, there could be terror in Russia as well.
Yeah, I mean, he was right away when this thing broke out.
I know. When Saddam Hussein was defeated in the Gulf War, he managed, and after the invasion of Kuwait, he managed to hold on to power with the help of mass terror. Yeah. So we could see something like that. I mean, I wouldn't count on. I mean, our intelligence services know, but I wouldn't be confident of that.
Mm. Well, there was another thing I wanted to run by you. These guys have a great podcast that talks to a lot of figures in military and intelligence called the Team House, and there's a very interesting clip they had because they've had, at least in some of the podcasts I've seen and stuff, like they've had some people who are knowledgeable about what's going on and everything, and have spoken about the importance of defending Ukraine and stuff like that. But they just had a dude in who is on the front lines in Ukraine. I'm going to read what they wrote here, but he's basically like training soldiers on the front lines with some of the weapons that are being supplied from the West and everything. And I'm going to play the video in our ears, and it's up behind you there. But he had some interesting things to say because this is a man who supports what's going on over there. I mean, he's on literally the front lines, like helping with it, but also sees a little bit of the nuance of some of the issues with some people on the Ukrainian side. And I see something like this, and I worry about this becoming more of a norm, and then a fight like this losing all support. Let me play it. And by the way, if you guys hear a skip and we're just talking about this, it's because it's copyright and I can't play it. So the video I will post in the description, but I think we should be able to play this in the corner of the screen, so I'll play it now.
It's a corrupt, fucked up society. So I'm not a big fan of Ukraine. Oh, what is that?
This is Buffalo Trace.
Okay. And the Ukrainians are in violation of the Hague Convention. There is I forget the exact phraseology, but it is. We looked at this closely, and it's there should be no filming of. The phrase, the terminology is bringing attention, blah 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 blah, to media, and yes, the Ukrainians are violating that. Absolutely. They're filming of a number of things that they're doing with POWs is violating law of armed conflict, and you can't, guys.
Right.
killing the Russian prisoners is
Right. And it's interesting because in the past, in you like Latin America or whatever, if U.S. Forces or employees were involved with any force that committed, war atrocities or
right
whatever,
back, right?
you have to, you're done.
Yeah.
But we're obviously not going to pull our support from Ukraine at this
Well,
time.
I mean,
these
Oh,
violations.
it's atrocities. No,
Yeah.
I mean it still is. I mean you shouldn't kill dudes who, I mean, everyone knows who surrendered. I mean, and there was plenty of that. But my point is, it's not about Ukraine. We're not like, I happen to have Ukraine flag tied to my bag, but I'm not. Oh my God, Ukraine's so awesome. No, because I understand that there are plenty fucked up people running Ukraine. It's not about that. It's about global norms, right?
Right.
So what this guy's saying is that, he still, in spite of some of the things he sees the bigger picture here and sees the threat that an illegal invasion has had from a much bigger nation. But it struck me as he's frustrated that Western narratives don't at least point out that, like, hey, while we're doing this, let's help fix some of the situation in Ukraine. He's not necessarily talking about Zelensky or anything, but in some of the legacy corrupt things that happen there. And it does tie all back to some things I at least mentioned earlier where, you're seeing videos that it's like, I feel like they're working against themselves putting them out. I'm not just talking about like the Sean Penn stuff. I'm talking about some of the things he's saying where they're showing some of these images of war. And again, they're attacking back against an aggressor, but it does feel like there have been some violations of some internet, as he laid out, of some international agreements on the rules of war and rules and engagement. So, should there be more of a message to maybe even from our end to get to a guy like Zelensky and say, hey, chill with being so bendy with some of these agreements because you're going to lose Western support if you keep doing that?
Well, this is a situation we always face when we're backing a country that is, to put it mildly, imperfect. It was the same with the Vietnam War. We were very upset about South Vietnamese corruption and human rights abuses. And that was before the boat people, before the Cambodia, before the millions of victims that followed the collapse of South Vietnam. And so the fact is that the shooting of prisoners, if that's indeed going on, and it wouldn't surprise me if it were, is not different. I mean, that the Russians are also shooting prisoners,
yes,
and that they are committing war crimes on occupied territory.
yes.
Everything began because Ukraine was attacked. Not a single prisoner, a soldier would have been killed. Not a single photograph would have been taken. Not a single abuse would have ever been registered if there'd been no war. And it wasn't Ukraine that started the war. And the overall principle has to be understood. I mean, yeah, you can focus on those things, but it doesn't. And it is true that Ukraine was a very corrupt country. I don't know what the situation is now under the wartime conditions, but Russia was as corrupt, if not more so. And what we're dealing with is a fundamental principle of international relations and world security, that you just don't attack a neighboring country and try and take it over. And it's not Ukraine that, by the way, that's bombing civilian infrastructure or attacking apartment blocks in Russia. It's Russia that's doing that.
Yeah.
So I mean, I would not, I would not treat that as a particular those facts as, they're good to know. They're not relevant to the question of who to support.
Yeah, I do think that's fair. The reason I bring it up is because of the people who are paying attention to this less and are seeing this as an annoyance, and then they hear tidbits here and there. They're not fully educated on everything that's going on, because
Yeah.
it is a very imperfect world. And
Yeah.
you are, no matter who your friend is in the world, including with looking inward at your own country, you're always going to have elements that are not good. There is no place that is even remotely close to perfect. So I don't want to hold Ukraine to that standard, but I think I'm like a lot of other people where I'd like to see peace and no war, and I'd like to not have the threat of, some psychos hitting some red buttons hanging over. And until we see some sort of resolution here, that is a continuing hanging threat, and I think that's very dangerous for humanity. But that all said, I really appreciate you coming in here again. It's a pleasure.
Always glad to see you, Julian. Glad to participate.
And I appreciate you coming up here to do it both times. Last time you even came in from like France and then by way of New York. So that was a great episode, and people had asked for you back, and I think your perspective is amazing and unique. And so long as this thing may unfortunately go on, I think bringing you through to fill in the blanks on not only some of the things going on, but the history behind everything and why it matters from a precedent perspective, as you got to do a lot today, is awesome for our listeners to get, and I just really appreciate you doing it.
No, thank you.
And where can everyone? You have an article that, when this is released, is coming out in Wall Street Journal.
Well, Friday. If I would ask people who are interested to pick up the Wall Street Journal, I've got an article about 100 years of the Soviet Union.
Got it. And you've written 6 books, is it? Is that right?
5, but a 6th is coming, because the 5th book is a collection of my articles, and now the publisher wants a 2nd volume of articles.
And it's going to be more collections then. Of
Yeah,
stuff
that
you've
will.
written from over the
But
years.
I'm working on a 7th book.
And what's that going to cover?
That's going to be a history of Russia after the fall of communism.
Ooh, okay, I'm in for that one. We'll
All
definitely
right.
we'll
Sure.
promote that one when it's coming out
All
for
right.
sure. But Mr. Satter, thank you, and I will see you again.
Thank you, Julian. Take
All right.
care.
Everybody else, you know what it is. Give it a thought. Get back to me.